Thanks, everyone. Everyone can hear me okay? This is an amazing venue. Like, this is fantastic. I've never actually done a talk outdoors like this before. It feels a little like a wedding, but it's actually quite cool. So I am going to refer to my notes a little bit, and I'm going a little bit out on a whim, like we had. I know, don't do it. Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that has sort of been in my mind for the last couple of years, primarily because having worked at the House of Commons or working at the House of Commons, I'm looking at work very differently than I have in my entire career. I've been a consultant. I've been in the architectural field for a very long time. And now I find myself working on something completely different. So I'm just going to talk to you about the narrative, and I think the role that the narrative actually plays in preserving the building and carrying it forward over time. And one other thing I was told is, so I was given a whole bunch of directives, keep the mic straight, so if I go off a little bit, please let me know. And I think the other one I was told is stay on course, do not divert. So I'm going to start off by going off course, all right? And I just want to bring one thing forward, and this is actually quite relevant, and I think it's quite telling, and it's going to connect to what I'm going to talk about today. There was an article in the Ottawa Citizen this week which talked about the addition onto the Chateau Laurier, and it was written by Peter Kaufman. So how many of you have actually read that article? All right, great. So the article, I'm not going to get into the opinion or whether or not, or the political side of things at all, but the article really talks about the fact that when you put an addition onto a heritage building, you really need to take two things into consideration. Primarily, Peter is saying that you need to take in the physical side of the building. So in this particular case, the Chateau style, or in my case, on Parliament Hill, it's the Neo-Gothic, and you need to take those into consideration. That's the physical side of the building. Do you copy it? Peter actually said something really interesting. He said, I think most architects would rather chew on a mouthful of thumbtacks than to actually try and copy the building itself. And I would wholeheartedly agree. The other side that he talks about, which is that I'm going to talk about a little bit more today, is the architectural ethos, the spirit and the narrative and all the thoughts and ideas and concepts that go into that building that you carry with you. And that's what the important part is when you put on an addition onto a building. He referred to it, and I love this term, he referred to it as the body and the soul of the building. So I'm going to start off with this quote right here. It says, an architect, you design for the present with awareness of the past for a future which is essentially unknown. This was by British architect Norman Foster. That's his quote. This is essentially what I've been living for a good part of my career. I've been giving either a plot of land, I've been given something to work with at some point or another, and I have to try and create the connection in some way. When you have a historical building, it makes it a heck of a lot easier. But how do you carry that soul through into your renovation or further into the design at some point or another? And I think that's the challenge. So what I'm going to do is, just to frame it a little bit, is give you a quick project that I worked on in my past, prior to working on the Hill. This one here is, I don't know how many, can you guys see the screen okay from the back? Because I need to know whether or not I'm going to describe it. You don't? Okay, great. I'm going to describe it to you as best as I can. There was a project in Toronto. So at the time, we were hired to do a building for University of Toronto, and the building was called CCIT. It was the Center for Communications and Information Technology. It was at the Arundel campus at University of Toronto. Have any of you ever been to the Arundel campus before or know University of Toronto? This campus is essentially, it's a satellite campus. It is surrounded by forest, and it's in a valley. Completely different context than what you would see for University of Toronto downtown. We had to find that connection. We knew that this is where you're going to build it. This is where you want the building. And essentially, we were trying to find something to relate to at some point or another, trying to create that narrative and that spirit of design to some extent. And there's this L-shaped building. And we start to look at the L-shaped building, and there are 3 sycamore trees within that L-shaped building courtyard, we'll say, which is surrounded by boreal forest. So they're quite unique. And we thought, well, we're going to inspire ourselves from, and carry the mic further up. Is that good? So we're going to inspire ourselves a little bit. We're going to inspire ourselves from the sycamore tree. We're going to actually take the spirit of the sycamore tree and see how much further we can actually draw that into the design at one point or another. And now you probably can't see this either, but I will describe. So in the center is, we took what looked like the sycamore tree bark, looks like camouflage. It is many various shades of green, and it's very organic in the way that it actually sort of folds itself out. We digitized it. This is the Center for Communications and Information Technology, and we thought we would take the natural world and we would start to digitize it and see what we would end up in. We started to talk about the idea of how those sycamore trees, we would create a courtyard around them, we would preserve them, we would leave them in the middle, and the building itself would be this filter between the boreal forest and the sycamore tree. We would digitize this thing and we would turn it into pixels, we would turn the elevation into pixels, we'd start to play with it a little bit. And then when it came to the landscape and the courtyard itself, we would actually start to unfold the sycamore bark. And we would start to pull layers up and we would push them down. We would work around the sycamore trees that were there. And so here you have a series of images that basically show you the evolution of that. And you've got an elevation which is full of color, different shades of green, which was really important to us, the landscape, and the far right. Where I'm going to take you is this image. It's not very telling because you probably can't see it at the back, but it is really the actual final elevation of that building. It is made up of a series of pixels, and in between the pixels, we made sure that the material that was used on the outside would actually be a mirrored material so that it would reflect the boreal forest, but there's a level of transparency that would allow you to see into the courtyard and see the sycamore trees, and therefore pixelizing the heck out of this thing and going from one to the other and creating a narrative and drawing a narrative from something that really didn't exist, but we had to go and grab what we could. The question I have for you is, if I actually showed you this elevation, which you can't see at the back, but if I showed you this elevation, would you be able to draw from that and understand the narrative and understand where we're going with the design? Likely not. I think you can probably interpret it. I think you guys are all fairly creative and you can probably come up with some different stories and ideas of how that elevation came about. But for the most part, there is generally always going to be that type of narrative that guides the design in some way or another. Before I go to the next one, I think I just want to touch on two things. That the narrative is a really important part of creativity and part of actually architectural design. And I know there's quite a few architects in the field or people that have actually studied architecture that are here today. And we all know that when we're in studio and we're working with our designs, we're often told that we have to work that narrative and we have to develop a strong concept. That concept is essentially for you, so that when you're developing that concept and you're going down that path, if someone tells you it should be pink instead of blue, your narrative or your design concept should guide you. And that's a very simple way of looking at it, but it should be strong enough to be able to guide that, because you know that at some point or another, while you're actually constructing that building, someone is going to come to you and tell you need to change something. And it is really important that you tie it back to that. The second part to this, and this is a little bit of a trade secret, but I think most of you probably have already figured it out, is that you need to make sure that you bring other people for the ride with you. You need to make sure that your client understands your design and buys into it as best as possible. Here's a quote. So Pearson is the architect for Center Block, and John Pearson was very good at keeping his vision and influencing people and making sure they thought it was their idea. It is a really important part to developing a strong design concept, is bringing the people along with you for the ride. Client being the number one. They're the one that have the money. They're the one that will, if you can convince them that they've got the vision as well with you, you can go quite far with your design. And I think that's a really important part. So I'm going to segue into Center Block a little bit, because we just talked about John Pearson. And so we're now into my current reality and where I'm working now. And there's a few people out there from the House of Commons, so you'll know this, and I think Finn is floating around too. So I'm going to touch upon this a little bit. But the example I've got here, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's a young girl that's actually hovering or just looking over the Books of Remembrance, the altar that's located in the Peace Tower in Center Block. How many of you have actually been in the Peace Tower or in the Memorial Chamber? Great. When John Pearson designed Center Block, a tremendous amount of thought, can you guys hear me at the back okay? All right. So there was a lot of thought that went into Center Block, and it is a very, very rich design. It has concepts everywhere. There are things such as the phoenix rising from the ashes. There's a sculpture over the Prime Minister's door. There is the There's the rotunda, or there is the compass. There's a whole nautical theme about the ship of state and how center block is really to guide our society and our people. It is embedded everywhere within center block. Now, the memorial chamber is actually quite unique, and I'm going to read from it because this is something that, is this that? I want to make sure that I don't miss this. So, architect John Pearson conceived the idea of the memorial chamber in the Peace Tower as a national shrine, a noble tribute to Canadians who had given their lives during the Great War. It is a solemn room which encourages reflection, a sense of peace and respect. It's remarkable for its detailed, for Gothic revival style. When you go into that room, and those of you that have been in it will know that immediately when you walk into a room like that, there are over 700 sculptures on the wall that all tie back to, in one way or another, the military. There are insignias on the wall. There's nature represented. The columns that are in there are fluted, and they end up going into a fan vault, which is to represent a series of trees that come up as though the altar is being sort of nooked into a forest. The outer walls consist of a blind arcade at the lower level, surmounted by magnificent stained glass windows. What this does is that Peace Tower, that room particularly, actually faces south, and therefore you get the light throughout the entire day. So when we worked on this, we knew that that was actually a very important part of it. The sun would come up in the east, it would make its way to the west, and it would work its way through the stained glass and actually has its impact in the room. The stained glass, having different colors, different tints, different densities, would actually provide sort of a quality of light throughout the entire day, which is exactly how we talked about. And that quality of light we referred to as dappled light at one point or another. As the design, the focal point for the chamber is an altar containing the books of remembrance that hold the names of 66,000 Canadians who died during the First World War. The altar itself, and when it was designed, so Parliament burnt down in 1916, 1917, John Pearson takes over the project, and that's when the Peace Tower concept and idea came about. At the time, we'd only gone through the one war. It was the Great War. And so the altar was actually located in the center of the memorial chamber itself. That was the tribute itself. Since then, we've had several wars, and so it's changed considerably. But the concept remained the same. The ideas were all there, and John Pearson gave us a very rich design concept and narrative to work from. So move ahead. We now are rehabilitating center block. As most of you know, we've taken the legislative functions out of center block and we've moved it into west block. The interim chamber has been moved over into west block. And now we are at the point where we're dealing with what we call enabling projects. It's how to move a lot of the stuff out of center block so that we can actually get in there and we can start doing the work that we need to do. One of the projects, very important project, very different than a lot of what we had done, was the memorial chamber. We were to relocate the memorial chamber and bring it to a new location in West Block. But if I go back to what I was saying before at the very beginning, the body remains, and we had to actually grab the soul from that and carry it into a new body, essentially. It was a new interpretation of, or a modern interpretation of what we knew John Pearson was trying to do. So here you have an example of a woman looking over one of the altars. We brought the altars into the new room, but the new room actually reflected a little bit new narrative. It was very similar. We grabbed all the same information. We knew that the neo-Gothic was an important part of the design. We knew that the Gothic arches that reach up, the fact that we're in a forest of light, we knew that the light density was important, the dappled light was all important. So we tried to integrate all of that into there. We added our own layer to that layer being that we were in a square room before. The altar at the Great War, main altar was in the center, and the other altars surrounded it. We now said that we have multiple wars and we have an opportunity to look at it differently, and that is now that altar is the first amongst equals, meaning that we knew the importance of it, we knew where it needed to be, and we treated it that way, but we created an oval room so that created an equality for all of the altars around because they all deserve the same amount of attention. So the narrative does evolve over time. It doesn't quite stay exactly the way that you wanted it, and if I go back to the project I showed you at the very beginning for CCIT, the minute that I or we create something and we hand it over to someone else, it kind of becomes theirs to then evolve over time. You have the job, or we have the job, of creating the strongest possible narrative and design that will survive over time. Heritage architecture is very unique, especially if it's public architecture, because it will make its way, and there are ways. So CCIT, as an example, was archived at the Canadian Centre for Architecture and had been documented. We won awards. So that's already a good step forward in actually making sure that that information and all that, the ideas get carried forward. One of the things this did was that we created this new narrative, which was borrowed from Centre Block. We have the Library of Parliament that works with us as a parliamentary partner, and it was very important for them that they also have the information necessary to interpret to the general public. They are responsible for giving the tours in West Block and Centre Block and the now Room of Remembrance. Giving them that information, that inside information, gives them the ability to be able to talk to the general public and give them the ideas, because those ideas are actually very fundamental. The room itself is a room. In this particular case, it's an interim room. It's only intended for the next 10 years. Are you about to tell me to do it again? Yeah. Okay. With that same idea, we now move to West Block, and we move to the interim chamber as well. Library of Parliament, again, interpretation necessary for them to have all the information. They had for years been working with Centre Block. As I indicated before, Centre Block is extremely rich in terms of design ideas. You walk 5 feet and there's about 25 things to talk about. It's incredibly rich for them. Now they're in West Block, which is the interim chamber, an interim facility. It was always intended, it was not intended to be a legislative building. It was intended to be a departmental building, so it doesn't have the same level of detail. I was asked to attend a meeting with them at one point, and I thought I was going there just to give them a little bit of insight on the construction. You know, the number of, I think Public Works has a number out there of 18 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of excavation or rock were actually taken out of it. And so thought I was there to give them about the data. But what it turned out is they were actually struggling with the narrative. They were struggling with the idea of how did we get to this and where do these ideas come from? Because we knew Centre Block and we understood it, but we're not quite getting the full story for this one. And so it became very important that we gave them as much of that information with regards to, essentially what I told you about the memorial chamber can essentially use almost the same story, or very close to, for the interim chamber that's here. The memorial chamber itself, the ideas, the neo-Gothic arches, were not that different. They very much tried to do the same thing with the steel. So you can see, I don't know if any of you can see the image, but the image basically is showing you that you've got a series of steel columns that are fluted that actually go up, or ribbed that go all the way up. They fan out like tree branches. The idea of it being a courtyard within West Block, knew that we were already back out to the natural landscape again. Tried to play on the idea that that would remain a natural landscape. The fact that the House of Commons is green is fantastic. And we played with a whole bunch of the Canadian ideas or symbolism that we pulled out of Centre Block as much as possible. The sheets of wheat, all types of different woods that we could probably reuse within the interim chamber. It became very important, again, to the Library of Parliament that we give them about as much information as possible, but it never really occurred to me that they would struggle with that. Move forward. So this quote, do any of you watch Game of Thrones at all? Okay, I don't. So I actually got this quote from Brene Brown. What I really like about it is the very last part of this quote. So I'll just read it out to you. Armies, gold, flags, stories. There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it. You are our memory, the keeper of all our stories. And by you, I'm actually referring to the building at this point. The building itself takes on those stories. When we start to occupy the buildings, when we start to actually take part in that building, so me as an architect handing it over to a client, they then actually continue the story at some point or another, and it's important that we keep track of that. So the next example I have is here. So at the very, very pinnacle, the very peak of the Peace Tower is the flag, and every day, a gentleman by the name of Robert goes up and changes the flag every day. But every once in a while, he'll have a guest that goes up with him, and they will actually sign the wall that's there. So there are very few people that have actually done it. If you see this image, it actually looks like quite a few people have done it. But for the most part, this is a reflection of our society. This is actually a good indication. We've got Wayne Gretzky, I believe we have Rick Mercer, we have prime ministers, we have MPs that have signed this at one point or another. It becomes a part of the cultural heritage of that building at one point. When we talk about preservation, sometimes we tend to go back and we talk about the physical building itself. And this is why I wanted to make sure that we understood that there's also a soul to that building, and it's really important that we maintain the ideas and all the cultural aspects that actually make up that building, that we contribute to the building at one point or another. That being a good point. So the body itself, the building, will have markings, will have scars, signatures. And another example, so this one actually is fairly recent for me, and I was quite fascinated by it, is I just went to London not that long ago and got a tour of Westminster. And as we were walking through, we were having the same conversation. How do you maintain the story and make sure that things don't get lost? Can you give me examples of that? I'll just give you quickly, there is a cabinet in there from the women's liberation movement at the turn of the century for the suffragettes. Look it up, Google it, it's fascinating. It had been basically concealed for years until an MP decided it is important that we recognize that cabinet. Otherwise, it's just a part of the building that no one really knows anything about, but it is actually quite important. What I'm showing you here is the Victoria Tower, which is the second tower, not Big Ben, but the second tower on Westminster Palace, has a ceremonial stair that goes up. It is the Queen's entrance. She will enter from there and she will make her way up. The Queen has her own guard, her horse guards. Those guards actually make their way, they actually make their way up the stair. And the image that you see here is they're actually facing up the stair, and when they all reach the certain stair, they actually do a rotation and they turn. And then they stand their position and they wait for the Queen to come up. When they turn, when they turn, their spurs hit the wall and scrape the wall. Their swords also will hit the wall. And this is a stone wall as you go up. It has left its markings over time. I mean, we're talking about centuries. Westminster Palace has a tremendous, rich history. This particular part was rebuilt, more or less, a little bit older than our Parliament, but more or less the same age, but has left its mark on the building. They're in a rehabilitation process as well, much like us, and they're talking very much about the cultural significance and a lot of the things that need to be preserved within that building. These are things that you would not associate to the physical side or the body of the building per se, but these are the things that contribute to that soul, that the stories that go with the building, and they're really important to keep. And so they already have that on their radar, which is really important. Last one is I borrowed two quotes from Creative Mornings. This one I actually thought was very good, is the beauty in our world deserves to be cherished, sustained, and rediscovered. We share this life, and every day we have the opportunity to act as thoughtful participants in it. I like this quote particularly because we talk about cherished, sustained, and then rediscovered. We're talking about the past, the present, and the future again. Then the last part is we all have, and every day we have the opportunity to act as thoughtful participants in it. So you can either voluntarily be part of that narrative or that story, or you can involuntarily. So without knowing, your boot will scratch up against the wall and you become a part of the story of that building in one way or another. But I'm just going to give you a quick example of something that also occurred just recently. Here we have the Room of Remembrance again. So not that long ago, I was making my way through the Room of Remembrance. I often will give tours to MPs, and in this particular case, I was giving a tour to some consultants, and the consultants were a group of architects. So this was really important to me that I make them understand a lot of the story, the history, the narrative, the soul of the building, not just the history behind the actual physical building itself. We finally ended up in this room at one point, and I'm getting ready to actually tell the story behind, much like I just told you a little bit of information with regards to the room. And it's such a rich room that I'm just pumped. The security guard or the Parliamentary Protection Service person that's there actually steps in. And then he starts to tell the story about the room. He starts to tell the story about how that ceiling was intended to be the original ceiling, the original concept and idea back at the turn of the century in 1917 when Pearson designed the memorial chamber. It was intended to come through the ceiling, the light, and it was going to shine on the altar, and that light was going to make its way through. Kind of went into a few other things, but I was just devastated because it's not true. That is not part of the story. Didn't know whether I should interfere or if I should step away, or wasn't quite sure how to deal with it, but just let him kind of do his thing. And then when we stepped out of the room of remembrance, I expressed to them that that actually changed a little bit. It's not quite what he said. But I did also indicate to the group that that's perhaps part of the narrative a little bit, that the people that actually occupy the building at some point or another will discover or develop a narrative. That narrative either becomes a common narrative to everyone, or maybe just to the select few, and it doesn't really go anywhere. But it will evolve on its own, and I think that's an important part of our creations. So the last part I'm going to leave you with, because I was just given 5 minutes, and I'm going to read from something again, because I want to make sure that I get this. The quote that I have here is, "For the Canada of an unborn tomorrow." It is a quote from the Ottawa Citizen back in the 1920s, and it's referring to center block, and I'll explain. So a strong narrative and design concept goes a long way in securing a building future. So it's a form of preservation, and I think we all have to recognize that if you create a strong design, and I go back to that first story that I was talking about, the body and the soul, you need to have a very strong soul to your building and to your design and to your concepts and to whatever it is that you create. Not every aspect of the design or narrative needs to be meticulously thought out. Leave room for interpretation or evolution of that narrative at one point or another. And I go back to the room of remembrance. We had, at one point, thought everything out, and then, I forgot to tell you, but on the floor, there are 4 maple leafs in front of every altar. The maple leafs are there to represent the fallen soldiers. They have fallen from the canopy, the forest. They have landed in front of each altar, and it's actually quite symbolic, and it's a very nice gesture. But we had 4 maple leafs. We have stakeholders. We have the Sergeant-at-Arms, we have Veteran Affairs, and we have the curator for the House of Commons, who are very directly involved in this project. At one point, the question was asked, why do you have 4 maple leaves? So what is it, where do you grab the information for 4? Why did you get 4? Well, we said, well, more than 4 was too much. It was too jumbled. And less than 4 just didn't seem right. It wasn't sensing it. That's it. It was about as simple as that. And I honestly felt at one point that maybe I should have gone a little bit further, or we should have gone further. And Finn, you're here. He worked on this as well. I think there was a little bit of a sense of guilt, but I also come back to what I was just telling you before, is that I do think that at some point it will evolve into its own story. Now, this is an interim facility. People will tell the story the way they want to. I am sure at some point someone will find the relationship between 4 maple leaves and 4 something in that room. And it will work its way out. The quote itself that's here, and the reason why it's important, is because when center block was designed, when John Pearson came up with a design for center block, he purposely left center block unfinished. That was part of the design. There are stones everywhere within center block that have not been carved. The intent was that center block over time would be a reflection of our society, that we would go in at different generations and we would change the stone. We would add whatever we would need to that would reflect us best at that moment. That is phenomenal. We talk about narrative and story. He purposely left it open-ended and left it to us so that we could leave our mark on that building, which I think is a phenomenal narrative in itself. The narrative and story must be communicated and shared beyond the client handover. Much like the first project I gave you and asked you, did you know what I was trying to do when we did this elevation or this building? I think it's important that we communicate it. I think it's important that we share it. And that is a big part of what we do as architects, and that's a big part of why I do this, so that you guys can know a little bit more about it. We leave our marks on our buildings. So as Winston Churchill, famous quote said, they shape us. And they really do, because over time, those buildings, like I say, have a cultural impact on us, whether it be signatures or the markings on the wall or something or other. They define us as a society in one way or another, or even individuals. We can't control the narrative or the story. I think that's the last thing I leave you with, because it will sort of have its own life at some point. We do the best we can, but I think the trick is create a very strong story, because otherwise it will get watered down at some point, or it will not be what you hoped it would be. Our ability to be able to share and get out there is, and to sort of share this with the general population, is a very important part of preservation for buildings, which is why I'm very grateful to Creative Mornings, Marwan, and Maxine for allowing me to share this with you today, and I truly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right, so we're going to take a couple audience questions for Darrell. We have a mic running here, so if you have a question, throw up your hand, and Marwan will get his morning workout in.
Hi, thank you very much for that. It was very interesting. I'm struck, though, with the dilemma of preservation and destruction. And so much that happens today seems to be indifferent to preservation. 24 Sussex, any of the downtown high-rises that seem to get stripped and rebuilt. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the balance of that.
Is this on? Okay. I was hoping it wasn't, but yeah. That's a very good question. My personal thoughts are, and this, again, I'm just going to share, this is my personal thought. I do think that progress is very important. So if there was any sense that in what I was just telling you today is I think if we can keep the soul and we keep the narrative of what it is that we were actually trying to create in the first place, and we can carry that through, then I think we're going to be successful in one way or another. So whether it be an addition, a demolition is a little bit different, but I've seen some very successful projects where they've actually demolished buildings, and they have in some way given a good nudge to what was there before, and they've actually carried it through into the new building. There are many cities in the world, Berlin comes to mind, where they've gone through a tremendous amount of devastation, and a lot of buildings have been destroyed, and they've done a very good job in actually rebuilding it, and they marry very well. Latest example is, and this is, again, this is a perspective, and this is my opinion at the same time, but having worked on Centre Block, we have British consultants that are working with us, and they look at heritage and preservation very differently than we do, primarily because we have this. And again, I'm going to go back to London. And when I was in London, they scaffold right now. They actually have scaffolding around Westminster. And there's no sense that they're actually wanting to show people what's behind it. They just need to do their work. London has so much to offer that you cover that one building, you've got a lot more to work with. We cherish what we have. I mean, as a nation, I think that, and we should, but we're in a very different place than a lot of other countries, and I think that other countries are also leading the way in terms of how they preserve their heritage and they preserve their buildings. So I guess my short answer is I caution that we try and hang on to everything too much. I think it is important that we progress as a nation. I think it should be a reflection of our society. If you keep hanging on to everything that's been out there, at what point are you actually going to reflect the new generation of people? I'm thrilled with the interim chamber. It is a new modern approach and a new modern design for our parliament. It is engaging a new generation of people that it may not have engaged in the past, and I think that is a really important part of preservation as well. I don't know if that. Yeah. Oh. I think that, sorry, the mic is back there.
Hi. So if design is a negotiation between the identities of the designer, the patron, the space, and the public consuming it, how do you keep from becoming absolute about protecting your vision so that you can be more inclusive with the final product?
That's great. Marwan, did you give him that question? That seems so, yeah, very well done. So I think, so I'm going to go back to what I was saying before in communication, because communication and your ability to be able to tell people, tell your client, I don't want, maybe tell is not that, but just share with them your ideas as you're going through, I think is a really important part of your design. Again, this is my opinion. If you're sitting down with a client and they have no idea where you're going with the design, but you just simply have the, do you like it approach, it becomes very subjective. And I think we all work in a creative area or creative field where things can be very subjective. You need to anchor it. And I think by anchoring it, I sort of indicated two things. One is you have to, as the creator, have to come up with that story. It has to be a solid story. So think about it. You also feed off of people as you're creating that story because you're kind of reaching out to their sensibilities, but you're also trying to put it back on them. And I think that's where Pearson was very successful. And I think a lot of very good architects are excellent, or designers or creators are very good at making the client or other people see what it is that they're trying to create. And in some ways, make it feel like it's theirs. They have an ownership over it, which allows you to then carry it through. And then, and this is just a recent reflection for me, but I look at all the work that I've done in my portfolio. I don't think I've really done anything because it never occurred to me that I needed to carry it through in one way or another. I'm grateful that I worked for very good design firms that were excellent in winning awards, that were excellent in documenting the work that they had and sharing it with the Center for Canadian Architecture. There are many examples out there where our work does get documented and gets carried through the future in that way. If you work in another creative field, there's got to be other organizations out there that can assist you in probably getting that information. And then things like this, just having the ability to get out there and talk to people about what it is that you're working on. I do hope that I have enlightened you a little bit on some of the aspects that we're working on, but I'm only scratching the surface. There's a lot more to it.
Hi, my name is Louisa, and I run Speculative Futures Ottawa, so I guess you can call me a futurist, but I prefer to be called a designer. So Center Block is actually one of the first jobs that I have worked on as just a new graduate, so I have sentimental attachment to it. And I have also worked on vernacular architecture in China, so carry on with the story, pursuing people's stories. So as a question for you, and as the architect who's working on this project, what are the ways that the architecture can preserve stories of people of diverse cultural background, as we know that Canadian culture is founded upon rich Indigenous knowledge and history? It's built by immigrants, people seeking refuge. Is that in any way reflected in the new design? How do you create space for that?
So without going too deep into Center Block, I don't want to get too political about it, but I will say that it's definitely on the radar with regards to looking at the future of Center Block and looking at the future of our country and how it gets reflected in Center Block. So that is going to be a big part of our challenge in designing going forward. With regards to, I guess, the first part of your question, I think again, my opinion, I think that we have to acknowledge the people and the participants that actually allowed us to make some of these things happen at some point or another, because we tend to maybe tuck it under the rug or not acknowledge it the way that we should. So whether it be our acknowledging First Nations, or whether it be acknowledging the laborers that worked on the canal, and how you acknowledge those people, I think is a really important part. We're only scratching the surface on some of these things with regards to how we share the information. It goes very, very deep. There are organizations out there that do a really good job at pulling that information together, and we don't all have access to it. We did have a really good discussion at one point with Maron and Maxine with regards to where does that information lie, and I spoke to someone earlier about there are some really good things like Lost Ottawa out there. I think, have you guys seen Lost Ottawa? Like, David McGee is doing a great job in documenting Ottawa and putting some things forward that in some cases could be considered completely banal, but it's actually quite relative, and I think it may actually touch upon one of us at one point or another. But I do think there are other organizations that actually do the same, and they dig a lot deeper. We just don't necessarily have access to it. So it just becomes a question of actually going to get the information, putting it out there. I don't know if I've answered your question with regards to Center Block. I'm not sure I can go too deep into it, other than the future of Center Block and the way that it actually reflects us as a society, all makes of life, whether gender or you name it, is going to be reflected in Center Block in one way or another. And that is the greater challenge, is how do you take the old narrative and evolve it so that it actually does reflect that? Because I think we're cognizant, we're at a point in our design career where we recognize that these things have to be included in there as well. It's not just about carrying that same soul forward. We can certainly talk about it afterwards. I'm not sure I answered your question very well, but you guys are very good with your questions.
That was an amazing, it's loud. That was an amazing talk. For work, I help businesses to make their spaces more inclusive and accessible for folks with invisible illnesses and invisible disabilities. And before this talk, I felt quite discouraged because I will hear business owners say, well, I want to make my space more accessible, but I have a heritage building. So I'm wondering for you, and from even some of your questions now, it sounds like, that is kind of being considered. How do we balance preserving the soul of the building at a time in which maybe these things were not on the radar of those architects, and still make it inclusive for today's society while still preserving that beauty, if you have anything to share on that.
Wow. So these are excellent questions. So yes, we are certainly looking at accessibility. We are looking at sustainability. We are looking at a lot of things that are very important to us as a nation and making sure that they get integrated. It is going to be a part. How do you balance between heritage? I think the only way that I can answer it is, it's funny. So I had a discussion with the architect over at Westminster, and I refer to it as conflict. How do you deal with the conflicts between heritage, sustainability, accessibility? And he said, no. It's complementary. They complement each other in one way or another. So I think the challenge is, and I think this is the design challenge, and this is where we prove how good we are at being able to actually design well, is how do you integrate these things without impacting the rest of it? There's going to be, like you can imagine, and I'm sure everyone understands that there's going to be a bit of a tug in one direction or the other. And it just becomes a question of which is more important when it comes to that particular situation. We know accessibility has to be a very important part of it. We are talking about universal access. We are talking about universal design, which goes a little bit further. It's the cognitive. We're dealing with all walks of society as opposed to people with physical barriers. We're really looking at everything. But sustainability is also in there. And I know sustainability is high on the radar. It's a very important thing to a lot of people. At one point or another, we're all going to put ourselves in a room and we're all going to have to sort of struggle over how we're going to deal with certain situations and preserve the heritage. I think that the narrative, if I go back, is going to change. It will, and I don't think change for the worse, and I think I'm going back to the first question, it will evolve, and I think it evolves in a good way. It evolves in a way that it actually reflects us a little bit better than maybe when it was originally built. It's not a bad thing. Yeah.
Last question.
Oh.
Hi, my name is Murray, and it is the last question. I wanted to change the building, and I wanted to ask you, as a restoration architect, and dealing with your circle of professionals, whether you've done any blue sky or thinking about what will be done with Notre Dame in Paris, which is probably the next big project.
Yeah, no.
I know it's way off topic. I'm glad it's the last question because I wanted to hear other people go.
No, so well within the circle, quite frankly, I have not had a chance to have a lot of discussion with my peers or with people with regards to Notre Dame. I think on social media, many of you may have seen some of the concepts that have come out, which I really admire. There are architects out there that, for better or for worse, are putting the idea out there, and they're maybe either challenging it or maybe they're going after work. But nonetheless, it is promoting a dialogue about what we could possibly do with it. And I think that's really important. One of the I guess I will say that with regards to heritage architecture, I think is really important that you challenge a lot of things and you push the limit. And that goes back to, again, the original question, which is I don't think that we necessarily always need to preserve what's there in the soul or the ideas that were essentially in place. But by pushing it and by actually challenging it a little bit, it will evolve a little bit more. And I know that there's going to be a heck of a lot of discussions with regards to center block. We've gone through it now numerous times with West Block, 180 Wellington. There are heated discussions. Like, it is a very passionate discussion to have. Notre Dame, I can only imagine, is going to be a huge challenge, and there'll be a lot of headbutting. Yeah, but unfortunately I haven't had that. Yeah, but thank you.